Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. Are you planning on getting a boa constrictor but have absolutely no previous boa keeping experience? Well, today I'm going to go over at a high level all of the considerations you should make before getting your first boa. If you're new to the channel, welcome. This is the place for all things related to boa constrictors. So if you want to learn all about keeping and breeding these beautiful animals in captivity, please be sure to subscribe to the Boas YouTube channel right now. Most of the boa topics I'm going to discuss in this video, I've already discussed in considerable detail in previously made videos. So if you want more information on a certain topic, feel free to check out the links that will come up as the video rolls. So first of all, is a boa constrictor an appropriate snake for beginners or even for someone who's never kept a snake before? And I would say that if you do your homework and provide the right husbandry requirements, the answer can be absolutely yes. A boa can be kept by anybody that gives it the proper husbandry and does their background research. There was this kind of out-of-date mentality that people should start off with a starter snake, something like a garter snake, and then maybe work up to like a king snake before getting into the boas and pythons. But I think that this is really misguided, and there's no reason why, if you want a snake like a boa constrictor, you should get another snake first. In fact, boa constrictors and snakes in general live quite a long time, so you should make sure you get the snake that you want, because you might have it for a decade or two. In addition, boa constrictors are no harder to keep than most other snakes, provided you do your research and have the right equipment. The first thing you're going to have to determine before getting your first boa is what kind of boa are you going to get. And if you're new to the world of boa keeping, there's really two main categories of boa keepers. There's the locality specific boa keepers who keep boas that can be traced back to a specific origin, like a country in South America or a specific island in the Caribbean. And then there are the Morph Boa keepers who keep boas that have mutations that give them unusual colors and patterns that are not seen in nature, like albinos and jungles and hypomelanistics, things like that. But for a newbie to the world of boas, I would say forget about locality and morph boas, and 90% or more of first-time boa keepers should get a boa like this. This is called a normal boa. So this is a Boa imperator as a species, also known as the common boa. And it doesn't have any morphs. It's just a normal wild type boa. And this is the type of boa that you'll most often see in pet stores. They often erroneously refer to it as a red-tailed boa, but the true red-tailed boa is a different species, boa constrictor, and they look quite a bit different. I'll show you one later in the video. But the normal boa, also known as the Colombian red-tail, is typically largely of Colombian ancestry, although these boas don't have any pedigrees, and you can't really trace any specific localities. Often they're a mixture of different localities. They can have some ancestry from Central America or even South America, but largely they're Colombian Boa imperator. And there are lots of these available, so shop around, get one you really like. This one is a selectively bred bloodline called a Coupe's Pastel, so it has kind of more bright orangish, pinkish colors. But some of them are kind of more of a yellowish brown, some of them are kind of a little more grayer, but they're all basically known as common boas. And these animals are great because they're really affordable, they're very easy to keep, they're docile to handle. They're intermediate in size. A typical adult is anywhere from 5 to 7 feet, not much bigger than this one. And they're a great boa for beginners. So for the vast majority of first-time boa keepers, I would say to get a common boa like this one. So the next question you have to ask is, where are you going to get your boa? And there are a number of different places that you can get a boa constrictor. The first and most obvious is the local pet shop. And many pet shops do have boas, as I read before. They often call them red-tailed boas, but they're typically these common boas. And that might be an okay choice, but you want to try to find a pet shop where they really have some reptile experience and they know what they're talking about. Many of the chain big box pet shops are not very good. They might have some boas for sale, but typically they don't have a lot of knowledge, and it's probably not the best place. You'll also typically pay a lot more at one of these big box stores. The second option would be to go to a reptile show. And depending where you live, most places in the country have these reptile shows several times a year, so it's probably within a few hours drive of you to go to the show. But reptile shows are advantageous in that lots of breeders bring their reptiles to sell, and typically you can see a wide variety of different reptiles, and you can talk to the breeders and get specific information about these boas. You can also see much larger variety of animals than you would see at your local pet shop. And then as an advantage, typically the common boas are more reasonably priced than at pet shops. And in fact, if you go to a show on the last day when the vendors are packing up and they want to lighten their load of stuff to take home, sometimes you can get a really good deal. And a lot of these breeders will be morph breeders, and as a byproduct of their morph projects, they have a lot of normal, wild type boas. So that's definitely a good place to go. Another option is online, and there are quite a few different online reptile sites. There's really three main reptile classifieds, which are kingsnake.com, faunaclassifieds.com, and morphmarket.com. And these three sites have a wide variety of different boas for sale. So you can buy them online by email, you can pay by credit card, and then they'll be shipped right to your house. And many people are a little apprehensive when first dealing with this type of arrangement because they can't see the animal. But it's very safe, and the animal will be shipped to your house by FedEx overnight priority. I've done this hundreds of times, both as a shipper and as a receiver, and I've never had any issues. So it's really simple and straightforward having reptiles shipped to your house. So the last option is a rescue boa. And you, of course, probably have heard about rescue dogs and cats, but there's a lot of homeless boa constrictors that need homes. And often these animals are perfectly healthy, and you can adopt them from your local humane society. So, what happens a lot is a teenager will get a pet boa, and they have it for a few years, but then they go off to college and they can't bring it with them, so they have to get rid of it, and they need to find it a new home. And often these animals will end up at these humane societies. What you don't want is any boa that has any health issues, because if it's got health issues, it's going to be very difficult for a beginner to deal with, and you might end up having a lot of vet visits, and it might be very expensive for the vet bill. So I would stay away from any animal that you're not sure is 100% healthy. But provided it is, a rescue boa is certainly a good option to get your first pet boa. I thought I'd show you another boa. This is a single gene morph boa called the VPI T-positive or caramel albino boa. It's got these beautiful yellow golden coloration. And so, as I mentioned, for most first-time boa keepers, just your normal, common garden variety boa is the best choice. But there's no reason why a morph boa can't also be a good first-time choice, like this T-positive albino. So the next topic I wanted to cover that you'll need to decide before getting your boa is how you're going to house your boa. And a lot of people, first new to boas, will use glass fish tanks to house their boas. And while this will work okay, a glass fish tank is really not the best home to put your boa in. So glass fish tanks don't hold heat and humidity very well. They're also not very escape proof for boas, and the boas don't really feel very secure in them because they are surrounded by glass. So while it's okay to keep a boa in a glass fish tank, like a 10-gallon aquarium, while you're getting started, you should definitely look into getting a dedicated snake cage. And there are a number of different types of plastic snake cages commercially available. Typically they'll have a sliding glass front or kind of a hinged drop-down doors, and both types work fine, and they're not very they're pretty escape proof, so your snake is not likely to get out of these enclosures. In addition, they really hold the heat and humidity much better than a glass fish tank. For an adult boa, typically in the 5 to 7 foot size range, which is what a lot of adult boas get to, the size tank or size cage that you should get at a minimum will be 4 feet long by 2 feet wide by 1 foot deep. And you can always put a boa in a larger cage. The larger adult boas in the 8 to 10 foot range should be in 6 foot long cages. So there's quite a few different types of commercially available snake cages available, but you can also make your own out of wood or plastic if you're a little bit handy, and typically you can save a lot of money this way. So feel free to try to make your own snake cage, and you can custom design it. The last type of boa enclosure that's commonly used by boa keepers is a rack system. And rack systems are particularly useful for boa breeders and boa collectors who have large collections of these animals. And you can see behind me, this is a homemade rack system that holds these, are called Vision boa tubs, and the sizes of these plastic tubs is 30 inches by 40 inches by about 11 inches deep. And they're useful for small to medium size adult boas in the 4 to 5.5 foot range. So I use them a lot for my smaller adult boas. Another example of a tub, this is an iris under the bed storage tub, a CB110 tub. It's about 40 inches by 22 inches by about 7 inches deep. It can also be used for small adult boas and for sub-adult boas which haven't reached their full size yet. There are a number of commercially available rack systems, and you can also build them yourself to hold various size tubs. So if you have a collection of boas and you're limited on space, it's always useful to use vertical space in order to keep more boas in the same amount of space. Once you've selected the cage type for your new boa, you'll have to choose a substrate. And the substrate is the material that goes on the bottom of the cage that the snake sits on top of. The substrate has a number of different functions. So it's something that the snake is going to feel comfortable sitting on top of, and it's going to feel at home. It also functions to absorb waste materials. So ideally, substrates should be absorbent, they should look good, they should be easy to change, and the snake should feel comfortable sitting on top of them. And there's a number of different substrates for boas. In fact, I use at least 4 different types of substrates depending on the particular boa. Unfortunately, there's no perfect substrate, and they all have pros and cons. So there's a couple varieties which are a particulate substrate. They're basically different types of wood chips, and the most common are aspen and coconut husk bedding. And the aspen has a nice smell to it. It looks nice, and the boas seem to like to sit on it. Unfortunately, it molds pretty quickly, and it has a lot of dust, which are negative qualities. The coconut husk bedding lasts quite a bit longer than the aspen. It doesn't mold, but the downside is it comes in these blocks that you have to soak in water to constitute it into this form, so it's a little more labor intensive. It's also quite a bit more expensive than the aspen. And then you can also go with a paper-based substrate. So the most basic is just newspaper. You know, a newspaper doesn't look great, it's not the best looking, it's not the most absorbent, but it's inexpensive, typically it's free, and it's really easy to change, and you can change it a lot every time your snake follows up the cage. And then one other paper-based substrate is corrugated cardboard. And corrugated cardboard comes on rolls, so this is a 2 foot wide piece I cut it to a 4 foot length. It comes in rolls that are like 250 feet. And the snakes like the textured surface. It feels comfortable for them to sit on. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's easy to change. So try different substrates, pick the one that you like. As I mentioned, there's no perfect substrate. Everybody's got their favorite, and sometimes you just have to try them and see which one you and your boa like the best. The next consideration for your boa's cage is a heat source. And so unless you have a very warm house, you're going to need to heat your boa's enclosure. And there's really two main ways that I recommend heating your Boas enclosure. The first is to use some kind of a heat mat or heat tape. And so this is an Ultratherm heat pad. This one is 11 by 23 inches, and it comes with the cord attached. And this heat mat will generate the appropriate temperatures for your Boa when it's used with a thermostat. Similar to this type of a heating device is something called FlexWatt heat tape. And it's basically the same type of design, except it doesn't have the cord attached. It comes in rolls that you can cut to size, and you need to attach the cord. So the FlexWatt heat tape is better for breeders that have large collections and they want a more customizable solution. For the typical first-time pet keeper, a Ultratherm heat mat or a similar heat mat that has the cord attached is probably your best way to go. So these types of heaters, they heat the bottom of the enclosure, but they don't really heat the ambient air temperature very much. So if you live in, or if you have a room that's colder than about 75 degrees, you're going to want to get a heat emitting panel. And this is a plastic panel. So the 40 watt panels are typically around 11 inches by around 15 inches or so. And they can be attached to the top of the cage. And they basically emit heat down and they heat up one side of the cage to the appropriate temperature range when used with a thermostat. So devices I do not recommend for heating Boas or any kind of bulb. So you don't want to use a light bulb to heat a Boa because it's way too much light and it dries out the enclosure too much. And you don't want to use one of those ceramic heat emitting bulbs either, just because they're very powerful, it's a fire hazard, and it's going to dry out the enclosure too much. So once you have your heat source, it's important that you get a thermostat because these devices are not meant to be plugged directly into the wall unregulated. And they get way too hot for your Boa if you don't use a thermostat. It's also a fire hazard. So you want to get some kind of a thermostat to regulate the temperature of your heat mat. And there's a couple different options. So for a beginner, this type of heat mat controlling device is economical and works reasonably well. This is called a jump start, and they're used for controlling heat mats for horticulture, for starting seeds. But you can get one of these for about 30 bucks. Basically, you just put the probe on the heat mat and then plug it in and set the temperature. And it works reasonably well. I wouldn't recommend it for large racks when you're plugging in multiple devices into the one thermostat, but it does okay for a beginner. There are also more complex devices such as a Herpstat thermostat, and these devices are way more powerful. You can program them to set temperature gradients. You can do temperatures that fall at night. I use a device called a Herpstat 6, which has 6 channels, and I can control 6 independent thermostat probes. Just a much more powerful device. Of course, a lot more expensive. But for a beginner, it's okay to start with one of these devices. So the obvious question is, what is the ideal temperature range for Boas? And as a rule of thumb, you want to provide a cool side of the enclosure as well as a heat spot, a hot spot. So the hot spot should typically be around 90 to 92 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cool side should be around 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. You want that hot spot just to be on one side of the enclosure, no more than 25% of the floor space of the enclosure. And you want to use your thermostat to control the hot spot so that it maintains that 90 to 92 degree temperature right inside the cage on top of the hot spot. You want the cool side to be 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you have a room that's around 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, within a tub with a hot spot of about 90 degrees, typically it will be in the 75 to 80 degree Fahrenheit range. So even though these heat mats don't really warm the air all that much, they do create some ambient heat. However, if you have a room that's below around 70 degrees, you're probably going to want to get one of the heat emitting panels because those devices are a lot better at heating the entire enclosure, including the ambient air. You can have one side set to about 90 degrees, and then the other side will likely fall in the 75 to 80 degree range. When you're setting up the temperature range in your Boas cage, it's important to read the actual temperature inside the cage and not to rely on what it indicates on the thermostat, because the temperature on the thermostat will often be above or below the actual temperature. And to read the temperature, I highly recommend getting one of these laser gun spot thermometers. And you can use it to precisely read the temperature both over the hot spot and on the cool side of the enclosure. If you're looking for a laser gun thermometer, there's a link to one I highly recommend in the description below this video, as well as links to some of my other highly recommended Boa keeping supplies. An important consideration is what furnishings to use in your Boa's enclosure. And I recommend two main types of furnishings to give the Boa adequate hiding places. The first are wooden furnishings such as this cork bark. And the cork bark has this nice rough surface that Boas love to wrap around and sit on top of. And when you cut a tube of cork bark in half, you get this nice hiding place the Boas love to go and hide under. In addition to cork bark, you might want to check out other types of natural wood furnishings. You can also use plastic hides, and these you can make from a variety of different objects. So these are some examples of plastic hides I made from these drawer organizers available inexpensively. I simply cut a little access hole on one side for the snake, and these are good for small to medium-sized subadult Boas. You can buy similar hides at pet shops, but you can make them much easier yourself and save quite a bit of money. In addition, you can make hides out of pretty much any plastic tray. So these are some inexpensive hides I made. This is a oil retaining pan used for changing your oil. Basically, you just cut a little hole, access hole. I actually melt it with a soldering iron, and it's great for a medium-sized adult Boa. Of course, you don't want to use this in your snake cage after you put oil in it. And then another example is this cat litter pan. I just cut a small access hole using a soldering iron, and it works great for a medium-sized adult Boa. Again, do not use this after your cat has urinated and defecated in it, but if you get a nice new one, it's great for your snake's cage. Another essential item for your Boa's enclosure is an adequate water bowl. And you can use pretty much any kind of shallow pet bowl as a water bowl. This is just two examples of bowls that I use. For most of my subadult and adult Boas, I use these 8-inch diameter plastic bowls. They're inexpensive and very easy to clean, and they last a very long time. And I've also used metal bowls like this one, which also work fine. Again, feel free to use whatever bowl that you like that holds enough water for your Boa to drink from. It doesn't have to be big enough for your Boa to soak in, just to drink in from. And you want to change the water at least once a week. Clean the bowls with a light dish detergent and give them fresh, clean water. A final item to get to make sure your Boa stays healthy is an inexpensive spray bottle that you fill with water. And then you use it to spray down your Boa's enclosure, especially the substrate, several times a week, and this will help you maintain adequate humidity. You want the humidity to be in roughly the 60 to 80% relative humidity range. This spray bottle helps. You can also get a cool mist humidifier to humidify the air in your snake room, which will help increase the humidity in your Boa's enclosure. One item that's not necessary for proper Boa husbandry are full spectrum bulbs. You don't need any ultraviolet bulbs that mimic the sunlight for your Boa. I've kept Boas for decades without using these kinds of bulbs and have had no issues at all. Boas in the wild typically don't get a whole lot of sunlight. They typically don't bask out in the sun. They will be hidden either under a log or some kind of shelter, or they're in a forest with a dense foliage. So providing ultraviolet light in captivity is not essential. If you want to get a light fixture to put in your Boa's enclosure, that's fine, and it helps to enjoy your Boa under the proper light. Otherwise, just ambient room light will be fine for your Boa. I wanted to show you another example of a boa. This is a 2-gene Morph Boa, a hypomeron boa. This animal has both the hypomelanistic gene, which leads to a reduction in the dark pigment, and the meron gene, which gives it pastel colors. So in combination, we have this really beautifully colored animal that has a reduction of dark colors. It is very light in coloration, and it has a lot of these beautiful pastel orange shades, especially on its sides. So this is probably not a boa for beginners, just because it's relatively hard to get, but most morph boas are pretty simple in their husbandry, not that much different from your common pet store boa. So the next topic I want to cover is feeding. And when you're feeding boas, most often they eat various rodents, most commonly mice and rats. And then larger boas will sometimes be fed rabbits, although even the largest boas can subsist on nothing bigger than a large rat. But boas will typically start off eating fuzzy mice, and then they gradually move up to larger size rodents as they get bigger. But rodents they can be bred yourself, or you can also obtain them commercially. So it's not very difficult to get frozen rodents that your boas will eat. Other food sources for boas that could be considered are birds, most often quail and chickens of appropriate size. And I like to mix it up, and my boas get mostly rats and mice, but I always give them quail once in a while as a special treat. So boas in general are really good eaters. It's very rare to get a boa that won't eat, unlike a lot of other types of snakes like ball pythons. If your boa isn't feeding, there's typically something wrong with the husbandry conditions. One question is whether you should feed live or thawed frozen, and 99% of the time you want to feed thawed frozen rodents rather than live. The only time I recommend feeding live are for baby boas, newborn babies that won't eat the dead or thawed frozen rodents. Typically I get my babies started on live, and then after a few meals I switch them over to frozen thawed. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to how often people should feed their pet boas. There's a lot of erroneous information that leads people to feed them way too often. A lot of the older snake books, and even some newer snake books, recommend to feed a boa every week, which is way too much. Basically, you want to feed your boa so it has slow, steady growth. Most boas are going to grow somewhere between 6 and 15 inches a year. You don't want it growing any faster than that, but you want it to have slow, steady growth for the first 4 or 5 years of its life. My basic feeding guidelines that I recommend: from birth until 2 years of age, I would feed every 10 to 14 days. From 2 years to 3 years of age, I would feed every 14 to 21 days. From 3 years to 5 years, I would feed every 21 to 28 days. And then adult boas, 5 years or older, I would feed about once a month. And this is a basic rule of thumb. Some boas will need to be fed a little more often or a little less often, depending on their body condition. And you can also mix it up a bit. You can feed a boa 2 weeks in a row, and then you can skip the next 3 weeks, things like that. Again, you just want them to have slow, steady growth. Adult boas will continue to grow a little bit for the rest of their life, but typically they don't put on more than an inch or two every year. A common question that beginners have is whether they should get vitamin supplements for their boas. And so if you are feeding boas nutritionally sourced rodents which have been fed a healthy diet, there's no need for vitamin supplementation. The rodents are a whole diet, and they have all of the nutrients that a boa would need, so no need for vitamins. As I promised earlier in the video, I wanted to show you a true red-tailed boa so you can compare it to the common boa that I showed at the beginning. And this is a Suriname red-tailed boa. Compared to the common boa, it has higher contrast and more crisp patterns, and then they're famous for their really long red tail, as you can see in this animal. And although these are amazingly beautiful animals, I do not recommend these for beginners. You should have experience with some of the other types of boas before trying a true red-tailed boa, just because they have much more rigid husbandry requirements. So I wanted to say a few more topics for the beginner, and I want to talk about shedding. So snakes will shed their skin several times a year. Boas will shed anywhere from about once a month when they're babies to about once every 3 or 4 months for adults. So you'll have lots of these sheds that start to pile up. You know, all animals shed their skin, including humans. Snakes just do it in one piece. So snakes should shed in one piece. If they shed in multiple pieces, or if it kind of flakes off and it's stuck to them, that's a sign that your humidity is too low. So what you should do, you should soak your snake in lukewarm water to loosen up the unshed skin and just gently peel it off once it's soaked. And then you want to increase your humidity. And as I mentioned, you want it typically in the 60 to 80% range. But if your snake is having trouble shedding, your humidity is probably too low, so you want to increase it by spraying down the cage more often with a spray bottle, as well as using a room humidifier. The last topic I'm going to cover in this video of things you should consider before getting your first boa is breeding. And I'll summarize this for the beginner in one word, and that's don't. It used to be that reptile keepers were advised to get a pair of whatever reptile they have so they could eventually breed it. And that made sense back in the day when there were very few reptiles in captivity, and a lot of them were being taken from the wild, and there was a shortage of these animals for pet keepers. Now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people breeding boas, and there's a huge variety to choose from, and there's actually an excess of some of the more common types. So there's really no point for people to be breeding them anymore, just because they're a pet keeper. Another thing is that breeding boas is a lot more complicated than breeding many other types of reptiles. It's very time consuming. Boas are harder to breed in general, with lower success rates in general. So I highly recommend you don't worry at all about breeding until you have at least a few years of boa keeping experience. So just enjoy your boa, enjoy learning about its natural history and behavior, enjoy learning about all of the great types of boas that are available, and after you've had your boa for a year or two, odds are you'll want to get a second one, and then you'll want to get a third one. And if you really decide that boas are the thing for you, at this point it makes sense to think about possible breeding projects for the future. But when you're first getting into boas, the last thing that should be on your mind is breeding them. So there you go, that's some high-level tips for things you should consider before getting your first boa. I hope this video was helpful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please shoot me a line and I'll do whatever I can to help you. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.